Well, we're in Romans chapter 11 and 12. And in the book of Romans 11, it says, Paul's basically asking, he said, well, what about Israel? Has God abandoned Israel? And he says, by no means. God has not abandoned Israel. Their mission was to be a light to the Gentile world, to be a light, to point others to Yahweh. But they lost their way. They became focused on works righteousness rather than grace and mercy coming from God, righteousness coming from outside of ourselves, which Abraham got. But his descendants began to focus on works rather than on the grace of God. And Paul then demonstrates and says, because of this, the people of God, God's passion to see the world reached, he sends Paul and others to the Gentile world to provoke the Jews to jealousy. And then we get to chapter 12. And in chapter 12, he says, therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to focus on God's mercy, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. When I lived in Savannah, Georgia, we were church planting, and we had a Jewish landlord, and she came by one day and said, hey, I'm showing this other part of the building to someone to do dog grooming. And she said, by the way, do dogs go to heaven? And I said, let's talk about that after you finish showing the property. And so she stopped back by my office, and this is a lady in her 70s, and she just said, so what's the answer? Do dogs go to heaven? I said, well, I don't actually know if dogs go to heaven or not. My concern is, will you be there? I know I will be. And I began to share with her about the love of Jesus, and she said, well, I'm Jewish. And I said, he was too. And gradually she began to lower her defenses, and she said, I've always believed that Jesus, Yeshua, was the Messiah. And she said, I've always believed that. And we were able to share together, talk together, pray together, and she yielded her life to Jesus Christ and accepted righteousness from outside of her own efforts and gaining merit to his fulfilling that need. I have a brother-in-law also from a Jewish background, and he too has become a follower of Yeshua, of Jesus. What a great time to talk about that as I'm recording this right before Passover, right before Easter for those from more of a Christendom background and experience. But we enter into chapter 12, and he says, what's worship? Worship, and we're talking during a time of quarantine within the world because of COVID-19. What is worship? Well, he says worship is offering yourself to God. And so I encourage you, you may not be able to gather with other believers during this season right now, during a time of celebration globally, which would normally be the case. But it's a time where you can go directly to God and you can offer yourself to him as an act of worship, just yielding your life to him. Paul goes on in chapter 12, and he refers to different gifts that are given. The amazing theme in Romans is Paul starts by saying, I'm not ashamed. And he's writing to a shame and honor culture. And he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And then he tells how shame entered the world, and it was the lack of giving thanks to God. And then he moves towards salvation being, we begin to honor God. We begin to give thanks to God. And then he gives honor to us. The word honor is always associated with gift giving. And God gifts us with the gift of salvation. He then empowers us through spiritual gifts. And Paul, in this passage, lists 7 gifts: prophecy, service, teaching, exhorting, giving, leading, and mercy. And then he says, but the goal of the gifts is to work together collaboratively as a team to love others. And ultimately, he ends the chapter 12 by saying, even love your enemies. Happy Passover, happy Easter. Read Romans 11 and 12. Take your next step.